Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, my guest is Craig Whelden. Craig is the author of Leadership, The Art of Inspiring People to Be Their Best, which contains 50 years of leadership and life lessons. That would be an amazing book to read, no matter who the author was. But Craig had a long career in the United States military, serving in various positions. He was Commander, Marine Forces Pacific for base operations, Deputy Commanding General, U.S. Army Pacific, and he served as the first Chief of Staff for a 4-star Navy-led Joint Task Force. And that's the very, very abbreviated version, but we're going to let him talk about his story in his own words. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate the invite.
Excited to be here with you today and learn about your book, but I'm also really excited just to get your life story because there's so much packed into this. Why don't you take it away for us a little bit? Tell us a little bit about how you got started, where you come from, maybe even where you grew up, as far back as you want to go. But tell us a little bit about your life, and then we'll make our way towards the book.
Well, I was raised in an Air Force family. We traveled all over the world. I went to Purdue University on an ROTC scholarship, thinking that I would give back 4 years to the Army and then I'd go off and do something else. And pretty soon 4 years turned into 30 years. And so I retired from Hawaii as the Deputy Commander of U.S. Army Pacific in 2003, moved to Florida, was in the private sector really for the first time in my life. I was a consultant for about 7 years, but about 5 years into that, my wife said she wanted to move back to Hawaii. And I said, Hawaii's really expensive. I'd have to get a job. And she said, that's a really good idea. So I spent the next 2 years looking for opportunities in Hawaii. And the Marine Corps created this senior executive position to move 9,000 Marines and all their family members from Okinawa to Guam and build a base in Guam. And I threw my name in the hat, was selected, and spent 9 wonderful years with the Marine Corps in Hawaii. And about 3 years ago, my wife said, I'm ready to move on again back to the mainland. And I thought we were going to stay in Hawaii forever. And I said, what prompted this? She said, we're too far from family. And I said, okay, I get it. So here we are now in Bluffton, South Carolina. But when she said that, I started thinking, what am I going to do next? Because if I'm going to disconnect from the Marine Corps and the military, what am I going to do? And somebody asked me that question and they said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to give back what I have learned over many, many decades to the next generation. That's what I want to do. And I'd like to do it by going on the public speaking circuit and becoming a speaker, a motivational speaker, an educational speaker, an inspirational speaker about leadership and life lessons. And they said, aha, you need a book. And I said, a book? Are you kidding me? I can't write a book. I was 66 years old, I think, at the time. And I had never written a book before. I'd written articles, certainly. And I thought I was a pretty fair writer. But a book was very, very intimidating. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, maybe I can do this. So I called a friend of mine who was a retired 3-star general, and he was an author of several books and was on the speaking circuit. So essentially, he was doing what I wanted to do. And I said, how did you get started? How did you write a book? And he said, I had a ghostwriter. I said, aha, okay. I could probably do that. How did that work? And then he explained it to me. It was over the course of a year, and they did interviews, and guy took notes, and he'd write a couple of chapters and send it to him and then review them, and they tighten it up. And over the course of a year, he'd write a book. And of course, the ghostwriter would share in the profits of the book, or the publisher would pay ahead of time for the book, and he would pass that on to the ghostwriter. The number of different kinds of arrangements. So I said, do you think your ghostwriter would be interested in helping me? And he said, I'm happy to refer him. So he did, and I called him, and he said, I'm really busy for the next year. I just don't have, and I said, do you have any recommendations? He said, there's an organization in New York City called Gotham Ghostwriters. And he said, they can find a ghostwriter that fits your needs. So I went to them, and I said, can you find a ghostwriter for me? And you fill out a profile of what you're trying to do and who you are and what the topic is of your book and so forth. And they find, for a fee, it was $1,000, about 5, 6, maybe 7 candidate authors who are accomplished, very skilled, and in your genre. And so I looked at all of those and I thought, well, after I've paid them $1,000 and then I pay the ghostwriter, whatever they charge, and it was anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 to have a ghostwriter write a book for you. That's a significant investment. So I thought maybe I can do this myself. So I started off and I started writing and when did I first discover leadership? It was as an Eagle Scout at age 14. So I just started writing from that point on. And I just kind of carried it through. And I did this over the course of several months. And over the course of about 3 months, I had a manuscript. And then I didn't know what to do with it. So I started looking on the internet for somebody could help me from that point forward. And I found this fellow in California who I did a little bit of checking on. And I thought, yeah, I think I can trust him. And I said, can you read my manuscript and tell me what you think? And he said, sure. For about $300, he could do that. So I paid him $300. He read the manuscript. And the first thing he said to me was, nobody's going to read this book. And I said, really? Why is that? He said,
that's some pretty straight talk there.
He says, it's a memoir. It's a story of your life. You're not Michelle Obama and you're not Amoroso. You're not famous. You're not infamous. For people to buy your book as a memoir, you need to be a personality. You need to be a celebrity. You need to be famous or infamous. And people will buy, just based on whose name is on the book. But nobody knows who Craig Whelden is, so nobody's going to buy this book. And I said, well, I wasn't intending to make it a memoir. What do you suggest? He said, I understand what you're trying to achieve. There are many, many great lessons learned, both for leadership and life in this book. Go through there, find them, find the ones that warrant becoming chapters, pull them out, make them chapter titles, and take these wonderful stories that you have of your life and fold them underneath. And then you will have the makings of a great leadership and life lessons book. And I said, okay. So figuratively speaking, I took a yellow highlighter and I went through the manuscript, did this on a word processor, and I found about 24 topics that I thought would be good chapter titles. And I pulled them out. I made them chapter titles. I folded the stories that supported each of those underneath. And then I rearranged the order a little bit because it didn't need to be chronological, starting when I was 14 and ending when I was 66. And when I got done with that, he said, now we've got something. Tell me, what's the most important chapter in this book? And I said, I think it's character, because character is the foundation of all great leaders. He said, that ought to be chapter 1. What's the second one? I said, I think trust. He said, that should be at chapter 2. And I said, okay. So then we did some rearranging of the order of the chapters to make them flow in a way that made sense. He helped me with some editing to make sure that when I made references to something in one chapter, it was appropriately addressed in the other chapter, so on and so forth. The thing that editors typically do. And then he helped me get it across the publishing finish line. His company is New Insights Press. He got the cover made for me, the layout, the photographs incorporated. It's on Amazon now in print, audio, and digital version. It's done very well. Won 3 national book awards. It's a #1 international bestseller on Amazon in 5 countries. So I'm pretty pleased with it. And I think it's a pretty darn good read, because when I went into this and started writing, I said to myself, I want this to be like John Grisham or James Patterson, a page turner. When people get to the end of the chapter, they don't want to put the book down. They want to go to the next chapter, which is kind of the way those famous authors are. And I tried to write it in that mode. I'm a storyteller at heart. That's what I do when I'm on stage. And that's what I did in the book.
Wow, that's great. So this guy, he was kind of a book coach for you.
Yeah, he was everything. He took me from a manuscript, which needed some work, and he carried me across the finish line. And it worked.
Now, the interesting thing here is he could have been nice to you, quote unquote, nice, and said, oh, yeah, this is a great memoir and everything. And then you would have published that, and then nobody would have read it.
Yeah.
And then it wouldn't have gotten you where you wanted to be. But because he was a straight talker and told you the truth, here you are, you've got your successful book.
Yeah, for anybody who's interested in following up with him, because he's now a good friend of mine. His name is Rick Benzel, Benzel. He lives in California, in the Los Angeles area, and his publishing company is called New Insights Press. I own 100% of the intellectual property for this book, and so he doesn't share anything. I paid him a flat rate. I'll let him talk to different people about what that might be, because obviously it depends on where they are.
But it was less than $40,000 for a ghostwriter.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it was well worth my investment. I did not write this book to make money. I wrote this book to help me get on stage, to tell my story to people, to help the next generation in leadership and life lessons. That's the reason I wrote it.
And so how is it doing with that objective? Is it accomplishing the objective that you set for it when you wanted to create it?
Yeah. So I've moved to South Carolina from Hawaii in October 2019. And I had my first presentation on stage in Omaha, Nebraska, about 3 weeks later to an audience of 250 for a financial management firm. They bought 250 copies of my book. I signed every one of them the night before I gave my presentation, and they gave the book out to every attendee. So that has sort of been the model that I've been approaching as I talk to people about speaking engagements is, look, I can give you a discount on my book if you want to buy it in bulk for every attendee. And I would say that in probably 80 to 90% of my speaking engagements on leadership and life lessons, they have purchased the book for every attendee.
That's fantastic. And so you're charging a speaking fee, and then you're also selling them the book, right?
Yeah, yeah. So next month, I'm going to Tennessee. I'm doing a medical group state conference in Tennessee, and there are probably 150 to 250 people in the audience. And they thought they may be able to get a sponsor to purchase my book at a discount. They weren't able to do that. So what I will do is after my presentation, I'll set up a table and I'll sell the book to individuals who are interested.
How did you adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently going through as a public speaker? Because it's hard to be a public speaker when nobody's going out in public.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I gave probably 4, maybe 5 presentations before the lockdown a year ago in March. The last presentation I gave live was the Los Angeles Fire Department Leadership Academy. Had 50 students. They bought 50 copies of my book. They've incorporated it into the curriculum. And they asked me to come back and be a regular speaker, which I had planned to do until COVID shut everything down. So I haven't been back out to Los Angeles yet until things settle down. But from that point forward, in March, I started soliciting online opportunities. For example, last month, I did a presentation to a graduate course in leadership at Emory University in Atlanta. And they bought 42 copies of my book, one for each of the students. And I gave they got the book before the presentation. I'm not sure whether they read it before or after, but part of the assignment was to, take notes on my presentation, which I did over Zoom, and then presumably read the book as well. And I don't know what they're going to do in class beyond that. But that class is meeting via Zoom now and has been for a number of months. So that's an example. I've done a presentation in Oregon to a medical group that after the end of the presentation, they said, how can people learn more about you and purchase your book? And I gave them my contact information, CraigWhelden.com. So, they could purchase the book online if they wanted to. But it hasn't been quite the same as in-person presence, which is what I will do when starting next month. I've had both my COVID shots. I'm past my 2-week period. And I told a number of people who invited me to give in-person presentations that as soon as I have had my vaccination, I'll be happy to do that, but I'm not going to do that until then. So I'm doing an event in Savannah on the 12th. I'm going to Tennessee on the 18th. And I feel pretty comfortable that I won't get infected and I won't infect anybody else. And because the one in Gatlinburg, Tennessee is a medical group, I'm pretty comfortable they will take the appropriate precautions as well.
I would hope so. So the question a lot of people have when it comes to public speaking is, great, I write a book, I set up a website, but then how do I actually get these speaking engagements? How do I get people to pay me to get on stage? How did you build your speaking business and get the leads so that you could go and get this business?
Yeah, there's a couple of companies out there that actually send you leads. I signed up for one of those. And so every month I get a list of conferences that are occurring in the coming 8-9 months or so. And I have a solicitation email, which basically introduces myself, tells them a little bit about me, tells them they can go to my website and see demo tapes. They can see testimonials about my book, testimonials about my speaking, testimonials about me, watch podcasts, read my blog. There's a wealth of information on my website. So, step one, I think, is you have to have a pretty darn good foundation with a website. And on that website, if you want to be a speaker, you better have a demo tape, because if you don't have a demo tape that's pretty good, people are just going to go, they're just going to pass and move on.
Right.
So
they don't know what they're buying.
That's exactly right. They want to kind of taste it before they dive in any deeper. So I spent 6 months or so, and I started this before I retired from the Marine Corps, putting a website together, getting a demo tape put together, gathering testimonials from people. And of course, all of that takes time. Every time that I speak to a group that where I'm well received, and I've been well received in every single one, I always ask the organizer or the person at the top of the food chain, I said, would you mind giving me a testimonial about how my presentation was received? And they've always been happy to do that. Just a couple of sentences. I have not yet gotten to the point where I've done video testimonials, which is the next step, which I can then incorporate into my demo tape, which you can also find on my website. So there's sort of a stair-step process. You have to have some building blocks, and you're not going to get live paid speaking engagements until you've done some free ones. And I've done a lot of free ones. Oftentimes, you can go give a presentation to like a Rotary Club, which I've done a number of times. And coming out of that will be an invitation to a speaking engagement that pays you. Because somebody was in the audience and they heard you speak and they said, wow, I'd really like to have you come speak to my company. And okay, you compensate for your speakers? Yes, we do. What's your fee? And then you start the negotiation.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So take us back a little bit more to your career and how you incorporated this into your book. Were there parts of your career that were difficult to incorporate into the book, or how did you draw those life lessons from your experiences and decide, okay, this is something that has to be in the book, or this is something I should leave out?
Yeah, great question. So I spent 40 years in the military, either in uniform for 30 or as a senior executive with the Marine Corps for another 9 or 10. And so it's hard to avoid that 40-year period for the things that I learned during that period. But I wanted to go into this effort, the book writing effort, making sure that I didn't target the military as my audience. I'm drawing from my experiences in the military, but I'm really targeting the civilian community, the corporate America, the nonprofits of the world, and just the average reader who just wants to do some self-improvement. That was my target. And I have a chapter in my book about communications, and I say that, one of the first things you do in effective communications is kind of analyze your audience. Who is it that you're trying to communicate to, and how will they best receive what you are about to say? Because it's not what you say that matters, it's what other people hear. That's what's important. So I always wrote every chapter with that in mind, that I'm targeting an audience that's non-military. So I got to keep all the acronyms and all that sort of stuff kind of off the table. And I got to write it in a way that's engaging, interesting, and fun. And again, like I said earlier, is a page turner. So I did that, but I didn't just write about my military experiences. Your listeners can go to my website, craigwhelden.com, to the book tab, and they can find a sample chapter, chapter 18. It's called The Light at the End of the Tunnel. And while the events that I describe in there and how I addressed that challenge in my life had really little to do with the military. So that'll give you a flavor for, I was in the military at the time, but the lessons coming out of that really had nothing to do with the military. And they were something that anybody could experience.
Mm-hmm. How long did it take you from start to finish, from the time you started working on the book in earnest to getting it published? What was the timeline, more or less?
So I started the first week of October in 2018, and I finished the draft before Christmas. So, people have drawn books out for months and years, and I was determined not to do that because I set a goal for myself to have this thing published 6 months before I left the military, because I wanted to get some traction going so I could hit the ground running when I retired from the military. When I got done with the manuscript, it took about 2 months for me to get it tightened up with that rearranging of the chapters and pulling the lessons out and making them chapter time and all that, and working with an editor. So probably December and January timeframe is when we did that. In February, I had to submit my book to the Department of Defense because I was a senior official in the Department of Defense. And if you write a book while you're in the Department of Defense, it has to be approved. That took another 5 to 6 weeks. So probably March timeframe, late March, they approved it, and it was on Amazon by April of 2019. So October.
That's pretty quick.
Yeah. And 6 months of that was the Department of Defense, reading through to make sure I wasn't giving away state secrets and so forth.
Was there any point in that process where it got tough, where you felt like, maybe I just don't want to do this, maybe I should give up, or you struggled with writer's block or anything? I mean, it sounds like no, because you went pretty quick, but were there any struggles with the process?
No, I understand people have that. I didn't. And I think it was because I was driven to get the thing done, and I was anxious to get it done. And once I got going, I had some momentum, and I thought, I'm on a roll. I can keep. And it was easy for me to do it the first time because it was chronological. And I just kind of started when I was at age 14, and I started walking forward. And I had in my mind, what are the lessons I learned in leadership and life over the past 50 years? And let me tell stories and tell about these lessons that I learned. So no, I didn't really have the writer's block problem or the any issue. I was task driven and time driven.
Well, now that you're building a name for yourself, do you have any desire to go back and publish that memoir at a future date?
No, I think that, one could argue that it is still memoir-like. I mean, you're still reading about the story of Craig Whelden. It just rearranged like a Rubik's Cube. It's just turned a little bit and it's a different color, but it's essentially the same book. All I did was take the pieces of the puzzle and put them together in a way that it could be conveyed and understood as a leadership, self-improvement, and life lessons book, rather than just the story of my life.
I think that's one of the best lessons to come out of this interview for our audience, is that because a lot of people do start out writing a memoir because it's what they know. They know their life story. They can write that. They can sit down, they can tell it, they can write it. But then they run into this block of, well, who cares? Who's going to read this? Why would anybody read this? But I love that it wasn't that you went back and wrote an entirely different book. You took that and you rearranged it. You made a pivot, and you were able to turn that content into something that people would care about and would read. And now you're having this success. I think that's a great lesson.
Yeah, the other thing is people need to realize that there is a huge effort to market your book, which they don't really understand. When you get done with writing a book and you get it on Amazon, you can't just sit back and wait for it to be sold. It doesn't work that way. You've got to aggressively market it. And I hired a couple of companies to help me market it. We had some Amazon 1 week free download opportunities, and I had probably 5,000 or 6,000 downloads worldwide during the 1 week period that this company helped me market it,
That's
which really
fantastic.
drove the numbers up and got me to the bestseller status on Amazon in 16, I think it was 16 different categories, because your book is categorized on Amazon as either a leadership book, a management book, a self-help book, a memoir, whatever the categories are. And one of the tricks of the trade is to find those categories that your book will fit into, as many as possible. And that way you narrow the competition for rising to the top.
What was the company that you worked for that service, or worked with for that service?
Oh, Bestseller Publishing.
Bestseller Publishing. Got it. So what other marketing did you engage in? Were there other programs that you tried? Were there things that you tried and didn't work, or what worked the best?
So, if you go to Amazon, there's a number of, Amazon's got a site called KDP, which is for authors, and that's where you go to see the back end of the status of your book and how many books you've sold and so on and so forth. There are a number of opportunities to market and sell your book through advertisements and so on and so forth. I didn't find a whole lot of benefit from that, certainly not enough to pay for the advertisement, because Amazon is an 800-pound gorilla. You love them or you hate them, but they're not the only game in town, but they're the biggest game in town. So if you want to sell your book and get it the widest distribution, you really need to work with Amazon, in my opinion. The trade-off is that they take a pretty good chunk of your money. So if you, of whatever you make. So if you sell your book for $14.95, and I don't even remember what the numbers are, they're going to take a good chunk of that. And you're not going to get a whole bunch of royalty from that. But again, from my perspective, that didn't matter, because I didn't write the book to make money. I wrote the book to get it in people's hands. I had one, for example, somebody ordered my book, read it. He happened to be the CEO of an IT company in Charleston, South Carolina. He turned to this personnel director and said, "Hey, this guy's in Bluffton, South Carolina. It's 2 hours from here. See if you can get him up here to speak to our team at a leadership conference." So she contacted me, said, "Our CEO just read your book, would like to, one, get a copy for everybody on the leadership team." That was 35 copies. And two, get you up here to give a presentation. And I did. And so, these things happen that way. I gave a presentation in Indianapolis, Indiana, to a group called the Contemporary Club. They didn't pay me a speaking fee, but they did pay for my airfare up and back and one night in a hotel. But there was a lady in the back of the audience that night who was from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And she came to me a week later and said, "Hey, I heard you speak in Indianapolis a week ago, and I'd love to have you come speak to our group next November." And so, through the negotiations, they have a speaker's fee. And so now I've got a paying speaking event in Indianapolis, Indiana in November that came out of a free speaking event. They also have a book club within the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she bought 25 copies of my book, and that was the January book of the month. So that all the ladies read and then talked about. And when I go up there, I'll be able to set up a booth after my presentation and sell the book individually. When I was at that Contemporary Club, one that I mentioned that was free, they let me set up a table and sell my book. Somebody walked up and I said, "How many would you like?" And he said, 50. I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "I'd like to have 50 copies. I'm a financial management person, and I think you got a great story, and I'd like to give these out to my clients." I said, "Okay, good." So in one sale, I sold 50 books.
The great thing here is that so many of us, especially when we're starting out as authors, we think, oh, it's all about Amazon and it's all online and it's all social media. It's all on the internet. And yet what you're telling us is a lot of the success you've had, maybe most of the success you've had, has actually been this one-to-one personal in-person interaction.
Yeah, you got to get some traction. And again, if you want to be a speaker, you got to start off free and just speak. And by the way, that's great practice. If you want to appear natural on stage, then you need to do it a lot. And when you give free speaking engagements and opportunities, to people, you get a lot of practice. And those stories become second nature. They come out naturally. And so I rarely turn down a speaking opportunity because it keeps me in practice. But there's really two audiences. There's the ones that will pay you, and there's the ones that don't have a budget to pay you. And quite frankly, some of the ones that don't have a budget, I don't mind speaking to because of who they are. I gave a discount, a significant fee discount. These are paying organizations, but the two medical groups that I'm doing in the two next month, I gave a 50% discount on my speaking fee because of what they've done over the past year with COVID. It's kind of a recognition for the service and they provide to America. You know, they are America's new heroes.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So you said that in your book, the first two chapters are character and trust. Is that right?
Right.
How would you apply character to being an author? If it's important for a leader to have character, an author is a type of leader. So how would you apply the lessons in that first chapter on character to being an author or becoming an author?
Well, everything you write needs to be true. You know, you can't stretch the truth. Let me tell a short story, and I think I'll make the point. When I became a general officer in the Army, one of the techniques that I picked up from one of the people that I'd worked for before was to occasionally, about quarterly, pull my team in that was closest to me, my aide de camp, my driver, my secretary, secretary general staff, the chief of staff, the people that were near me every day closely. And I'd said, look, I will never cross an ethical boundary by design. Circumstances may pull me across that boundary and I'll find myself on the wrong side of it. And I don't want that. So what I'm telling all of you is I want you to have your antenna up, figuratively speaking, and be aware that circumstances often take senior people beyond the boundaries they're supposed to go. And then say something. I'm telling you now, I want you to say something. Hey, boss, we probably ought not to accept that gift that this foreign dignitary is trying to give you. Or if we accept it, we need to dispose of it in the appropriate manner. There is a process where you can accept gifts and then dispose of them properly. Anyway, then I would have the lawyer for my organization give a presentation on where those boundaries were so that everybody knew exactly where they were. So I made sure that the team around me understood where my ethical boundaries were and that I was counting on them to make sure that circumstances don't pull us as a group on the wrong side of that boundary. Accepting a meal that's more than $10 in value is an ethical violation in the US government. It just is.
That really restricts your options these days with inflation and everything.
That's true. It does. And it was hard for some people to understand when you said, you know, they want to host a dinner and so forth. And you say, you know, I just can't do that. I mean, I'm happy to have dinner with you and we can go Dutch, but I just can't accept a meal because the value exceeds what I'm authorized to accept. So your question is about becoming an author. You know, be true to yourself. Look at the characteristics of a strong foundation in character. And I talk about that in my chapter. I thought character was so important that I actually refer readers at the end of the chapter to two more books that focus exclusively on character because it's really the foundation. And I think people start seeing cracks in character in senior people when pressure gets on them too much, or they forget who they are, you know, that they're subject to the same laws and rules that the rest of us are. You know, there's a Latin phrase called memento mori, and what it means is remember you are mortal. And as the story goes, a Roman general is coming back from a huge victory. He's going through Rome on his chariot, and all the citizens of Rome are throwing down all the confetti on top of him, telling him how wonderful he is. And his slave, who's right up there on the chariot, is charged to whisper in his ear occasionally, memento mori, remember you are mortal. And too often people forget that when they get power with them. So having humility as a senior leader is very, very important. I talk about that in chapter 1. and remembering your roots. You are subject to the same rules as everybody else.
Great lessons. What were those 2 books on character that you really liked?
So one of them is called The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity. It was written by Lieutenant General retired Bob Caslin, who used to be the superintendent at West Point, and Michael Matthews, who's a professor at West Point. This book was just published in 2020. I wrote my book a year before that, but I thought this book was important enough to include in my book that I went back in and edited my book to add it at the end of chapter 1. I had already had this other book. This one is called Building Your Leadership Legacy. It's all about character by Robert C. Carroll. And he too was a professor, the director of leadership department at the United States Military Academy at West Point. So I don't think West Point has a market, the corner on character, but it's one of the foundational elements they teach to every single cadet when they go there.
Are there any other books that had a large influence on your book, or that you looked to as kind of mentoring you through the process of creating your book?
You know, I've read a number of novels, fiction novels, that when I got, as I said earlier, when I got to the end of a chapter, I like John Grisham, I like James Patterson, and there's a couple of others that I like. But when you get done with a chapter, you don't want to put the book down because he kind of ends the chapter with a hook in to you, which makes you want to go to the next chapter. You know, some of these exceptionally well done series that you can watch on Netflix and Amazon Prime and all that, they do the same thing. When they get to the end of an episode, they hook you in a way that says, wow, I can't wait to get to the next chapter to see how this turned out. They drop the bomb, if you will, right at the end. So using that philosophy, I tried to apply it in ways that I thought might work well here by, you know, putting an exclamation point of some sort at the end of every chapter.
Yeah, it's not just for fiction. This works in nonfiction too.
Absolutely does, yeah.
Well, Craig, it's been so great to talk to you today. There's so many lessons that you've shared with us. Once again, where's the best place for people to connect with you and learn more about you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. Craig Whelden is easy to find, Whelden, not DON. And CraigWhelden.com is my website. I tell people you can get a window into my soul on my website. You can learn not as much as my wife knows about me, but almost.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us here today. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate the invitation.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.